everybody. My name is Dr. Scotty Horey. I'm a faculty member at the Music School of Delaware, as well as an artist and clinician endorsing Sabian cymbals, Vickfirth sticks, Mapex drums, and majestic percussion. Welcome to my new lecture series, Tools for the Journey, and here we are, episode number 4, which is writing skills and communication skills. And we're also going to talk about reading a little bit. Remember, this lecture series is about giving you 8 basic disciplines as tools to start addressing really challenging problems in whatever your employment or whatever your particular life challenges might be. And of course, in each one of these 8 disciplines, I'm not going to detail any one given topic. I'm just going to outline the basic academic discipline for you in hopes that you'll pursue it and use it further. So, today's going to be about writing and communication skills. We need to learn how to write at all levels, from grade school to high school, college, and even graduate school, postdoctoral, and professional. Not only is it an essential part of any education and an essential ingredient of literacy, and of course we know that there's a lot of illiteracy around the world, especially in third world environments, writing is also a valuable skill professionally, and even as an artist or a creative person. Not to mention, it has benefits therapeutically and has been proven to help people work through ideas and solve complex problems, which thinking alone or discussion alone can't achieve. Also, reading and writing is one of the essential ingredients to building general cognitive ability. And of course, a lot of social sciences research shows that general cognitive ability is one of the largest, most valuable areas of social capital for people, for individuals and for large groups. And what I mean by that is success in academics, success in health and wellness, and getting out of things like unemployment and poverty and crime. So general cognitive ability is the center of that discussion, and writing and reading are a very big part of that. And there's many benefits to knowing how to write well. From an educational standpoint, there's cognitive processes of reflection, contemplation, as well as organization and even creativity that happen when you engage in writing, and when you engage in writing correctly. You're forced to put an idea, a story, a narrative, an assertion, an argument, or a report in successful language that is clear and understandable to others, and even to you. Of course, we all know that even if we have a really interesting idea, it is somewhat disorganized when we just think about it on our own. We have to flesh it out in either discussion or writing. Okay, so let's go into more depth about the value of writing and reading. Studies show that reading and writing improves memory by keeping the brain active in ways that, for example, watching videos and movies does not, even educational videos and movies or documentaries. Studies show that people with reading and writing habits experience less memory loss as they age and lowers their risk for neurodegenerative disorders or disorders such as Alzheimer's. And there's a strong connectivity and cognitive activity that happens when you engage in reading. Reading can also reduce stress. It can induce relaxation, and many people use it as a sedative before going to bed. Harvard studies show that reading fiction can even help one understand their own and others' mental state to improve things like social skills and empathy and emotional intelligence. Reading also improves vocabulary and verbal fluency. When you write, you're taking abstract ideas or images, emotions, beliefs, perceptions, and you're putting them into concrete language to communicate to others. So it can be a source of reflection, such as journaling or keeping a diary. And like I said, writing can induce relaxation, and it can improve mood and executive function, and creates a problem-solving, organizing, and focusing process in the brain that is active and experiential. And like I said, this probably because, or one of the reasons is because it extends your memory, improves your not only long-term memory, but what's called working memory. So your ability to consolidate a number of useful facts in a small period of time based on what you're doing in the day, which takes a lot of brain metabolism, of course, and facilitates editing and clarifies your thinking if you're trying to organize an idea. So there's many different kinds of writing. And of course, here we are in just one 45-minute lecture, and we're not going to go in detail with any one of them. I just want to introduce you to the basics, of course, which is one of the themes of this series. Let's just talk about a few of the different kinds of writing. There's expository writing, which is a report, a review of literature or essays. There's reflection, and some of that is subjective writing. There's scientific writing, which is very challenging to read. There's storytelling, narrative writing, descriptive writing, even fiction. There's persuasive writing. And there's two of my favorites, an artist statement, which you have to write if you're an artist or a musician or a visual artist or a dancer, and journaling and or poetry. That can be very personal. And there's tons of research that talks about the therapeutic benefits of journaling to understand your own internal dialogues and beliefs and emotions and relationships. Today I'd like to focus on 3 different types of writing from that list. I'd like to take a brief tour through expository writing, or essays, reflection writing, and artist statements. So let's talk about expository writing first. The first thing I want to say with that is you're writing an essay. You're trying to narrate a point. You're trying to make a coherent idea that sounds convincing. First thing to say is always do several drafts. Gosh, that almost goes with any type of writing. It's important to do several drafts. Usually the first one is just, it's kind of like when you're improvising on a musical instrument. Well, it's kind of like when you're trying to compose, if you're a composer instrumentalist. Usually the first couple times you play through something, it's just kind of getting ideas out there. So always do several drafts. Make an outline and create several tiers of bullets, sometimes including specific information that can be seeds for longer narratives, which will be paragraphs. And remember that there's different levels of resolution of essays. And what I mean by that is sort of like the atoms, the molecules, the cells, the organism. There's words, there's sentences, or I could say there's letters, there's words, sentences, then paragraphs, then the full essay. So there's different levels of resolution, and they have to make sense at each tier of resolution. So your sentences have to make sense. They have to be coherent. The paragraphs have to make sense as a unit in itself, each one being a unit in itself. And of course, the whole essay has to make sense with the order that you choose for the paragraphs and the chronological points that you make. I would suggest in expository writing, or if it's an essay, limit paragraphs to 100 words or less. This is to preserve clarity in your chunks of ideas. Order your paragraphs in logical order and fortifying the idea in a way that naturally builds. The next step of doing this type of writing would be to actually write each paragraph as a standalone, nice narrative from beginning to end. Maybe reorder the paragraphs. And then, of course, once you have the whole thing, revise and make a new draft. And, of course, it can help to have a peer or a teacher or a professor proofread it. Sometimes, actually, I send my writing to some of my colleagues, and I just say, take 5 minutes and read this over. And very often I'm surprised with little things that they'll notice that completely escaped me, that were obvious edits that needed to be made. Not only just grammatical edits, but flow or certain points that maybe were out of order that didn't quite make sense. So it's always good to have someone else read it and check it over. And if you're a child, ask mom or dad. Okay, and of course, format it correctly. And that has to, and we'll talk about formatting in a moment, but that has to do with the criteria that your teacher or your school or your organization gives you. All right, let's talk about reflective writing. For this, you're going to be a little bit more personal. This is a bit more qualitative. It's descriptive. You're going to talk about an experience. Perhaps it's the attendance of a concert or seeing a movie or doing some type of new trip, a vacation, a new exercise routine, listening to a piece of music, et cetera, et cetera. And you're going to create a qualitative account of that experience, and then you're going to reflect on the further meaning it might have for you personally or for your organization. First thing I'd like you to do if you're doing a reflection writing or reflective writing is create a picture of the setting and the context. Next, create a narrative of what happened from a factual point of view. It's very straightforward, just to paint the picture for the reader. Next, use qualitative language. So there can be good and bad writing here, of course. Use descriptive words that excite the senses, whether it's visual, auditory, touch, smell, taste, to try to create a powerful image for the reader about what this experience was like. And like I said, just because it's subjective doesn't mean there isn't good and bad examples of this type of writing. I am sometimes blown away by some of my college students' poor ability to write qualitative language and reflection. So for example, if you're writing about a piece of music or your experience listening to a piece of music, you don't want to say things like, well, I thought the piece was cool, but I didn't like the ending. Because that's getting somewhere, but it's not descriptive enough, and it's not vivid enough, and it's not detailed or specific enough, and it's certainly not going to separate itself from other people's unique viewpoints. So a better example, and I'll just try to make something up real quick, would be, and of course this involves having to have knowledge about the field itself, but you could say something like, the second piece of music was in ABA form, and I liked the B section because I liked the change from the major key to the minor key, and the tone of the clarinet was smooth, and it was accompanied by cello in the low register with a dark tone. So I'm just making something up, but that clearly is using more qualitative language, and it could also include things that are personal. Like, for example, in the B section, when the cello started playing, it brought me back to when my grandmother used to play the piano for me. So these types of things are more personal, and they're unique for every person. So that's what makes this reflection writing or reflective writing powerful. So once you do a good account of whatever the experience is, don't be afraid to make it personal. Describe the relevance it has to your life, your perceptions, your values, your goals, your aesthetics. And if you remember what aesthetics means from the philosophy lecture, it's criteria which might constitute if something is beautiful or ugly. So that's called aesthetics. Or perhaps the experience gave you a new creative idea, or it made you feel like you could reminisce about something. It reminded you of something. And when you're doing this, of course, again, use qualitative language, good descriptive things that excite the senses, including taste and smell. All right, the third type of writing we're going to talk about is one of my favorites, and I think a very difficult one to do well. We call this the artist statement. So as you could probably guess, an artist statement is very, very, very different than some of the other ones I mentioned earlier. Expository writing, scientific writing, documenting evidence, et cetera, et cetera. Artist statement is very personal, very unique, and involves a lot of qualitative language. And of course, again, just because it's personal and creative and unique doesn't mean that there's not good examples of artist statements and bad examples of artist statements, which may or may not have anything to do with the quality of the artist itself. You can be a great artist and have a very poorly written artist statement. And I'd be remiss in saying that if I don't say that you could also be a very bad artist and write an incredible artist statement. So obviously, if you're one of my students, you should have both. That's what I would expect. So let's talk a little bit about artist statement and what it means to write a good artist statement. The first thing you should do is provide the first thing I would suggest is to provide a personal narrative and a story about who you are as an artist, how you began your work, and what the inspiration for your work is. So, for example, in my work as a performing artist, my work as a teacher I would consider somewhat separate, but my work as a creative performing artist takes a lot of inspiration from spirituality and meditation, as well as natural landscape, and things such as movement and groove. So that's a pretty specific thing I could cite about my work. But again, that's not to say that every artist is going to have that experience or should write that in their artist statement. For example, maybe, and I know a lot of different artists who draw their inspirations from very different things, including things that I never would even think of. I know someone who loves to do improvised painting when she hears jam bands like Fish or Widespread Panic. So that's a really interesting inspiration. It's something I never would have thought of. And that person should write about that in their artist statement. What got them started with wanting to be a musician or a painter or a dancer? Maybe it's the sound of calypso in Nigerian churches, for example. Maybe that's the thing that really turned on that inspiration for you to try to create something yourself. So you want to write about that. That's a good way to start. You should talk about which traditions are a part of your work. Because, of course, every artist has derivatives. You should use historical and social examples. Like, for example, when I do my artist statement, I talk a lot about rock music and about classical training, because those are two really big traditions that came well before me that had a big influence into what my work is. You should also talk about what cultural influences are part of your work. We all have cultural influences. We all come from various social groups and ethnic groups and socioeconomic classes. So you want to talk about how that has influenced your work, because I think that's a sign of authenticity as an artist. So talk about which styles and aesthetics influence your work, or which ones you feel are representative of your work. And I think it's okay to cite other artists or famous composers when you do this. So the reader has, unless you're famous, so the reader has a good frame of reference to basically start to understand your work at the beginning of your artist statement here. So for me, I guess what would that be? I usually reference Steve Vai, Dream Theater, Nebojša Živković as maybe a good start, because that kind of covers the gamut of progressive rock, experimental rock, marimba, and some classical music. So those are three artists that I frequently use. I might say Chick Corea. And again, that's not to say that I want to simply emulate those artists. It just gives the reader a frame of reference to kind of start to see what this artist is all about or might sound like. The other thing is, try to describe the context of your work in a social setting or a cultural setting. So everybody's work as an artist has to exist in some setting. It doesn't exist in a vacuum or out on the moon. It exists in a social setting. So again, to use myself as an example, not to say that your work is similar to mine, but I talk a lot about having music that has rock music and grooves and Latin grooves in a classical setting, because a lot of times when I perform, I'm perhaps at a classical concert series or at a university, and that's a challenge and a unique part of my work, is that I use those traditions, but they're frequently in the setting of maybe more of a classical music community, which you'd see at a concert series like maybe Schubert Club or Thursday Musical, for example, in Minneapolis, or at a university. So talk about the social context of your work, and maybe even some consonance or dissonance that you're doing that in. Of course, how is your work unique? And that's the real challenge of being an artist. And it's a real challenge of writing an artist statement, is how is your work, how do you as the artist believe that your work is unique? So perhaps it addresses some type of activism that's new. Perhaps it fuses styles of music that have not been fused before. Perhaps it has a combination of rhythm from one style of music and lyrics or language from a different part of the world, and you're putting them together. Perhaps your unique background has shaped what your artist work is like. So you want to detail that in your artist statement. And what values do you have in your work, or what specific value do you have for your work? Okay, like I said, for some people that might be something like activism. For others, it might be, well, in my case, one of my efforts is to bring, the jazz and rock and popular music community more closer to the classical music community. That's a goal of my work. So what values do you have in your work? And maybe for some people, it's trying to promote a new type of musical instrument. Maybe you have created an experimental app to make electronic music. Maybe you've created a new musical instrument, and part of the value of your work is disseminating the importance of that instrument. I know a lot of artists who come from abroad who one of their primary objectives is to actually be an ambassador for the instrument that they play in the United States. And that's a really fascinating value to have as an artist. So that's something else you should include, if it's relevant to you, in an artist statement. You should also write how your work as an artist is compatible to whoever you're writing for. Because usually in an artist statement, you're writing to a school or to a potential host for one of your events, or for a grant, or for an application. And you want to make sure that you identify how your work as an artist and where you're at in your career is compatible with this host or this school or whoever you're writing to, and that it's a good marriage, and it's a good compatibility. Because there could be a great school or a great program and a great artist, but they just might not be a good fit. And of course, if you're doing an artist statement, there might be some competition. There likely will be a lot of competition to go to the next stage of career development or whatever you might be writing for. And you want to, or the new audience that's going to be at this event, or whoever you're writing to. And you might want to detail how there's a good relationship or mutual benefit between those two parties. Okay, and that could even include some potential criticism to other types of applicants, not by name. Obviously, I would not recommend that, but criticism towards artists that may have done the program in the past, of course not being referred to by name, but just some aesthetic or pragmatic criticism you might have for other types of applicants, and to try to outline why your concept of the project or your compatibility with the organization might have greater value. Okay, so let's move on to the next section of our writing and communication skills lecture. And we're going to talk about something very important that's not been discussed recently, which is how to cite sources correctly. And the very first thing I'm going to say is make sure you have sources. It really doesn't matter what level of writing, even if you're in high school, you should have some sources to support the points and the integrity of the claims you're making in your writing. It can only help. And if you're doing things like scientific writing or social sciences writing, you absolutely need to have many sources for the work to even be taken seriously. So the more credible sources you have, the more powerful your narrative is going to be, because it shows that it's not only your opinion, and we talked about this in the education lecture a bit, that it's not only your opinion, but it's fortified by other work that has taken place. And in the case of citing research studies or scientific research, large pools of data that perhaps support your argument, either directly or indirectly. So the first thing to say is make sure to have sources if you're going to write. And there's maybe some exceptions to that. Artist statements don't necessarily have to have sources. Although if you include a point, maybe about something public policy or something in economics, it certainly couldn't hurt to have one or two sources at the end of even something like an artist statement. And we're going to talk about two types of formatting, two styles of formatting. We're going to talk about Chicago and MLA. Chicago is typically used for business and history. MLA is typically used for liberal arts and humanities. And there's some differences of opinion with that. Of course, you want to check about who you're writing for, or your school, your organization, whomever you're going to turn the writing into eventually, to see what format they desire for your sources. There's also APA format, which is used in social sciences and sciences. And CSE format, which is probably not as familiar to most people, not as used frequently, but is sometimes used for science as well, such as physics, for example. But we won't talk about that today. Let's talk about Chicago and MLA. We're going to go through this pretty quickly to be thorough here. If you're going to cite within the body of text, for Chicago, basically what that looks like is the following. Let's take a look at this. So we have the author, we have the page number, in parentheses we have article, and then here we have the author, we have the title, and we have the edition. Okay, so that would be for a book. For MLA, if we're citing within the body of the text, typically we use the phrase, the author, in this case Dover, has expressed this concern, or some wording to that. And then, of course, we use the page number, the citation number directly after that. Okay. For articles from an academic journal, and again, if you're writing in music education or music pedagogy, in my opinion, we need to frequently cite from the psychology literature and the cognitive science literature, so this is what you would use. So for Chicago, what this looks like is the following. So we have the author's last name and the first name. We have the title, in this case, Conundrum, a story about reading. We have the name of the journal itself. And then we have the page number. We have the edition number. We have the date, or the year rather, then the page numbers, and then the publisher. And for MLA, this looks like the following. Authors, the article title, the publication, the volume number, publication date, and page numbers, and the medium of publication, so the publisher. So it's very similar to the first one. And there's an example right there from Beyond Growth. Okay, so if this is a book, in Chicago, it would look like this: author's last name, author's first name, the title of the book, and the publisher, and the year. Pretty straightforward. And MLA, another example here. We have the title, we have the edition, we have the publisher, and the name. Then the date. You should also cite websites and web sources. And of course, when I did all my writing in graduate school, we didn't do this as much, but now it's very important. And of course, you want to make sure that the websites you're using are credible. And for Chicago, web looks like this. And social media looks like this right below it. Okay, so just take careful note of the order of things: dates, titling, authors, and in the case of the web, the URL itself. Okay, an MLA article in the full-text journal accessed from a database looks like this. So we have last name, first name, we have the title, we have the name of the journal, we have the location of the edition of that journal, the year, and the page number. And then we have the actual database. And then we have the date that it was found online, because of course websites can change, unlike paper books. Okay. And also with MLA, if a work is untitled, you may use a genre label such as homepage or introduction, etc., etc. All right. If you're citing from a dictionary or an encyclopedia, in Chicago, it's going to look something like this. So you have last name, first name, you have the title, and then you have a comma, you have the page numbers, and then you have the publisher and the year, and with a period. So yes, indeed, all those details are important. And MLA, citing a dictionary or encyclopedia, looks like this. Okay, very similar, but just small differences in the formatting. Okay, I'd like to switch gears and talk a little bit about communication skills. So this is similar to reading and writing, but this is a little more of a personal habit type of topic that I'd like to go through. And social skills and communication skills are of utmost importance no matter who you are or what you do, unless you live in a cave by yourself, which I wouldn't exactly recommend. If you're going to be employed, if you're going to participate in creative activity, if you're going to have good relationships in your family, all these sorts of things, there's some pretty large-scale given things we can talk about that are important for social and communication skills. And then with that said, this is a very complex topic, and of course, the experts here would be social workers or clinical psychologists. Neither of those things I have credentials for, obviously. But with that said, I'm going to bring you through some very basic, very important points about social skills and communication skills. And if you're not extroverted by personality temperament, some of these things can just take practice, and that's okay. It's not, you don't have to be ashamed to practice something like conversational skills. I guess I never did that because I felt I was pretty socialized all the way from childhood, and I felt pretty comfortable in front of groups of people and, making small talk and all of that. But some people are very anxious in social situations, and it can be harmful to their career or their relationships. So it's important to think about what types of things can be useful. And again, a good social worker or clinical psychologist is really the expert into helping these sorts of things. And those resources are out there. So there's no reason not to learn some of those things from these professionals. And of course, I'll also say that since the pandemic, we've had a lot of social isolation. And of course, here we are, 2023. We're getting back to it a bit, and I think we've made some big improvements. But we've had a lot of transference of work and social interaction to online mediums and video and Zoom and these small windows on your computer screen, which is an environment of limited and controlled communication and of social interaction. So we need to get back to working together and establishing bonding and all these social cues and community-based interaction communication that are very important. I would go as far as to say for any mammal or vertebrate, it's very, very important and deeply rooted in our evolution. So first thing we'll say with that is the importance of discourse and discussion and listening to shape opinions and solve problems. Those of us who are maybe alpha personality have a hard time realizing that, in fact, when you interact with others, it has a therapeutic effect and a productive effect to trying to make sense of just about anything. And that's okay. Not everyone has to come up with their conclusions to things in isolation. It's very good and very healthy to discuss things with others. And of course, that's the foundation of free speech, which is one of the most important things in a democracy, certainly here in the United States, is freedom of speech. We should be able to have discussions about ideas openly without being attached to the idea of being black or white, right or wrong. And not to mention, when you solve a problem or when you come to an agreement as a group in the context of social and communication skills, that's a very gratifying feeling. And of course, I'm sure there's neurophysiological substrates to that, namely oxytocin and serotonin, and how those neurotransmitters work in the human brain and how important they are to our health and well-being. So again, I want to put a stress on taking effort to engage with others in discourse, discussion, to help solve problems and shape ideas about things. And to not be attached to being right, but rather attached to learning more about the subject matter. Communication skills. So, social cues and some of the psychology behind this, and just a few tips for good conversation. And this is, I would like to say on a personal note, one thing I always admired about my grandmother and about my uncle, John, we call him Unky. They both came from, I think, a family lineage of just being really focused conversationalists and just really elegant conversationalists. And so whenever I had a conversation with my grandmother, I had this I had this distinct, comforting feeling that she was really listening to what I was saying. And she's a well-educated, well-cultured person, but she was able to somehow put all of her ideas aside while listening to others, and really kind of trying to get to the bottom of what was important for that person that she was talking to, and what was important to them, and what their perspective was like. So I think this can be somewhat of a lost art form, and I think it's difficult to teach this to children and preteens and teens now, is just the art of having a good conversation and the art of being a good listener and a patient listener. And of course, I'll say again that social workers, counselors, therapists, clinical psychologists are very good, if granted the person's good at what they're doing, which is not a guarantee, are very good at these sorts of things. They're trained to try to improve these types of skills. And indeed, they are skills, just like playing a musical instrument or typing or knowing how to fix an engine or something. They're skills. So the next thing I'll say with regards to this is that can take place in person, ideally in person. But nowadays we're doing a lot of digital communication, and this has introduced some really interesting dynamics between people. Of course, we all know that interesting dialogues can happen on Facebook threads, Twitter threads, and I can't help but be so fascinated with how that's shaped relationships and opinions even in the past 6 to 8 years. I mean, vertebrates and mammals have been finding ways to communicate with one another socially for millions of years, and yet only in the past 6 or 8 years have we dramatically changed the way we communicate with one another, especially with some of these mediums. So without going into too much detail, all I'll say is that take great care and be mindful and aware of how you communicate with others. Sometimes it's a quick message, of course, and sometimes it's a longer message. And of course, many people now are using text and WhatsApp, Snapchat, and then the social media platforms, of course, usually Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. One suggestion I have is try to delineate what you're going to use each platform for. So I might discourage you having, the compulsion to check all of your platforms and all of your, text messages and emails just sort of sporadically throughout the day and then respond haphazardly. What I try to do, and I'm not always successful, obviously, is try to delineate what I use different platforms for. So usually with Facebook, I try to just post about career things and respond to direct messages. And I try to only use it once a day. And I find a behavior for myself that works. Like, for example, I know I'm going to be on the computer in the morning, so I'm just going to check Facebook in the morning and kind of make that my habit. And then with something like text or WhatsApp, that could probably be something that is more of an ongoing thing, especially for short messages. And then for email, usually what I do is I reserve email for longer ideas and work-related things and travel-related things. So just giving you some examples of how I maybe navigate that. And for you, it's going to be very different, perhaps. All I advise is that you try to think of how you're using various platforms for communication and also know how to limit them and moderate them so that they end up getting the job done. Whether it's talking with family, talking with coworkers, talking with colleagues, working through logistics, or even just, participating in Facebook groups or things like that of like-minded people, or YouTube comments. All I ask you to do is be mindful of how you use them, how to moderate them, and I would say as well to be respectful as often as you can when you're using these platforms. Okay. And the other thing, too, that can be really powerful is to be concise in messages. So again, that would probably goes for especially maybe social media and email, is that if you answer the question someone has concisely and respectfully, and you proofread it, you can get the job done very well. If it goes on too long, or if it's meandering, it might lend itself to misunderstanding. Okay, so to get a little bit more into the psychology end of things with this, the first point I want to make here is that when you're engaging in communication, whether it's family, friends, coworkers, creative colleagues, students, your children, et cetera, it's well known now in the social sciences and psychology that people are hugely different in personality and in temperament. And it's very important to realize that people can function and understand things very well using very different methods. So to know that intellectually hopefully stretches your ability to be patient out a little bit more. People can interpret things very differently than what you intend. There's some really interesting research coming out of the West Coast now, namely Stanford and some of those schools that are doing some of the health and wellness research, that actually emotional cues are way more confusing than we ever thought. We used to think that there was consistent facial expressions that signified emotions pretty much broadly over large groups of people. And the more we learned, the more we realized that, just to name an example, the correlation between facial expression and emotion is very variable from one person to the next and can be very confusing. So the first thing I'd say is if you want to get better at communicating with others, just know that people are very variable in their emotional temperament, their perspective, their psychological orientation, even functional differences in brain. And that's going to make communication very dynamic. And it's going to also involve you to be very curious about other people, which I think we should all value, and very patient. It's very challenging to get two people to understand a complex idea together. So that just takes a relationship and constant work at communicating often. So conversational skills and debate skills. I'm going to make the same point again. It's very important to listen to other people's points deeply and contemplatively without interrupting. Okay, so take a moment and just try to observe what mode someone might be in. And sometimes people are in a very calm and logical mode, and sometimes the same people can be in somewhat of an emotional mode. And as a good listener, it's important to simply observe and try to enter someone's space if indeed you want to try to communicate with them. And that's something that we have to value as part of a dynamic relationship. And what I would suggest is to listen to people without interrupting them. And this is something we're all working on. And sometimes I'm just absolutely stunned with how quickly even adults interrupt other people without listening to them finish their idea or finish their thought. And again, whether that be an idea that's important to a pragmatic issue or maybe just expressing their feelings about something, it's really important not to interrupt people. And I teach my students that as often as I can. And of course, chime in when you feel their idea is done, and then that creates a nice bridge, two-way circle, which I think is a good conversation, a good mutually respectful conversation that likely will make headway in whatever is being discussed, instead of going in circles or being disrespectful or condescending in some way where there's clearly one person dominating the conversation. And a few other just pointers about this. Again, not being a social worker myself, I suggest you ask questions about the other person's interests and make observations about other people's interests and other people's points. It's very unattractive, especially if you're an alpha type personality, to be preoccupied with talking about yourself or your own ideas or your own points, and always wanting to elaborate on them instead of asking and inquiring more about the other person's perspective or subjective experience. And the other thing too is try to restate someone else's point or someone else's idea in your own words. I've tried to do this recently as a teacher with my students and when I'm collaborating with someone creatively. That's a big gesture of respect to someone. If you're able to hear what they're saying and actually even repeat it in your own words to show them that you've interpreted and understood the idea. So that's something specific I might ask you to try. And of course, body language and eye contacts can be important. And there's huge cultural differences with this, even within United States, and especially when you get outside of the country. So I have no great advice for that. There's nothing funnier than the culture clash of trying to hang out with someone from another country, and you just have to laugh because things like body language and eye contact and tone and how loud, how soft you're speaking, how fast or slow you're speaking, there can be huge differences between people, even from the same culture in that, and maybe even amplified across cultures. So again, the same advice goes: just be patient, have fun with it, enjoy it, and try to stop yourself for a moment and just take it in and try to match style. And of course, in sales, that's called matching and mirroring. And I'm not a sales type of person, but that's been shown to be successful in the field of sales, is if you match and mirror someone a bit and you try to sort of enter their space, then you can have a dynamic interaction, even if it's someone you don't know. And then with that said, I think with maybe a few exceptions, eye contact is a good gesture of respect. And again, can't say that 100% of the time because there's cultural differences there, there's neurodiverse differences with that. But I think we can safely say making eye contact and gesturing with your body language, openness towards someone, is a gesture of respect and is a gesture that you're listening to them. And also a gesture of confidence in yourself as well. Okay. And as you get into a flow of discussion or interaction, whether it be through email, and I almost would say regardless if it's work-related, family-related, every once in a while try to take a moment to make a point that speaks to the unique chemistry of the people in the room. I think nowadays it's very easy to rapid-fire facts and data, but that can be really disinteresting for people in the sense that if you're interacting with a team, here's an example. I worked with a really great mindfulness team at a summer camp last summer. We had 4 people from really different perspectives that were all really good at what they do. And as often as we could, we tried to bring up points that not only had to do with our own expertise, but that were unique to these 4 people. Like, for example, I say, I've noticed that I'm doing this and it complements what you're doing really well with that. So to actually make it personal and to try to think of unique things that make the chemistry of that particular people stand out, instead of just sort of rapid firing facts or data or the thing that you're best at, to try to highlight the chemistry in some way and actually make a conscious effort to bring it into the light. That can be good for strengthening a relationship. Okay. And here's one that we're all working on, myself definitely included, is be able to take suggestions and constructive criticism. And maybe as you get farther and farther along in a career, this becomes harder and harder because you become more and more, I guess, studied and more experience under your belt. So sometimes that can make it harder to see something from someone else's perspective. So it's very good to admit if you were wrong, if indeed you were wrong. And it's also very important to appreciate someone's suggestion, even if it's something that maybe you don't want to try or you don't think you should try. It's very good to show gratitude to people that are giving you suggestions or giving you feedback about what you're doing, and to not always be defensive or emotionally defensive. Easier said than done, of course. The last thing I'll say about this is one that's maybe difficult to describe. I would caution other people to bring into discussions that involve dynamic relationships with people things that don't have to do with the relationship itself. And this is a very common problem, I think, now, especially with maybe sort of hyper-politicization of many issues and of maybe conspiracy thinking and sort of anxiety-based thinking about, lack of trust in organizations and these types of things. It's very easy to sort of bring in baggage to a discussion or to a relationship that doesn't belong there. So again, that's not very specific, but that's something I'd like for you to think about, is try to see the subject matter or the topic of the conversion together at face value. Okay, so what we're going to do is just a quick review of all the topics we talked about today. And I want to make a point to say that if you want to pursue any of these things further, please consult people that have more credential than I do about such things. For example, professors in the English department, or there's plenty of centers to help you with writing, so writing development centers. There's faculty development workshops, there's HR workshops to improve your writing, all those sorts of things. And communication skills, I would say the experts there would be people with credential in social work, therapy, and clinical psychology. So those are the real experts there. With that said, let's review the big topics we talked about today. We talked about the basic values of writing and reading. We listed several different types of writing, and we went into more detail about three: expository writing, reflective writing, and artist statements. And we went into a little more detail, I would say, about the artist statement. And that I have substantially more experience in as a performing artist. I've done many artist statements. So hopefully you found that helpful if you're a creative person developing a career. We then moved on and talked about how to cite sources and focused on Chicago and MLA. Then we talked about social and communication skills, which includes some personal perspective for me. And we talked about things like having good two-way respectful interaction, the importance of deep listening and social interaction, the importance of social interaction at all, and we'll talk more about that in the applied neuroscience lecture. It's very important to simply converse with others socially and have dialogue and discourse with others about important topics and problem solving. So we talked about that. We talked about good conversational skills and some tips about strengthening the bond of the people that you're communicating with, whether they be family, friends, or colleagues, coworkers, creative partners, et cetera, et cetera. And throughout the episode, we gave you some action items. So just to review a few of those, I would suggest you experiment with writing. If you have an idea about something, just try writing a draft. Use some of the techniques we talked about before, and then maybe make a second draft. Maybe send it to a friend or colleague or a teacher and see if they might take 5 minutes to read it over and give you some tips. And just observe how that might change your thinking about the topic itself. Another action item would be proofread your emails. and your correspondence, including weird voice texts and things, because it's very easy to make errors and it's very easy to create misunderstandings. And in the worst cases, misunderstandings that can lead to emotional tension. So please, an action item would be, I urge you to proofread your correspondence and choose your words gracefully. One more thing you could try, and this is our last action item, is next time you prepare for a work meeting or a Zoom meeting, write down a few of the social and communicative things that we talked about as making a point to try them during that meeting. So perhaps it's asking a coworker something social about what they did last night. And even if it sounds hokey, to actually write it down, so make it a point to remember to do it. Or to inquire to someone about what their latest project or their latest point is about a given issue, instead of only being prepared to talk about your idea. And make specific behavioral things before you start that meeting. You can even jot them down on a notepad and consciously try them during the meeting. Okay, so that does it for episode number 4, Basic Writing and Communication Skills. Thanks so much for checking this out. Again, this is one of 8 major topics that I'm calling Tools for Your Journey. And in every one of the 8, we're not going to go into great detail. I want you to pursue these further on your own. I just want you to be as best equipped as you can to live your life in a changing present day and solve problems and pursue best health, body, mind, heart, spirit, and culture. So thanks so much. Please stay tuned. ScottyHorey.com, Scotty Horey on Tributary, or Scotty Horey on Facebook. And thanks so much for listening, and we'll be back with episode number 5.